Good morning, good afternoon, everybody here from the central office in Geneva. My name is Jan-Henrik Tiedemann. I'm the IEC Academy Manager, and I'm happy for you to join this webinar about conformity assessment and standards development. Today we have David Hanlon, the IEC Secretary of the Conformity Assessment Board, who will explain you in details about conformity assessment and standards development. And I think it's very important to see the relation between conformity assessment and standards development, because obviously both fields depend on each other. David will explain more in details about this. Just some information on the background. You can find the slides already on the left hand in your GoToWebinar pane. Here you find handouts, and there you can already download this presentation and can have a look at it. Afterwards, we will also send you the presentation per mail. And very important, any question you might have, you can enter in writing in the questions field. And at the end of the presentation, David will have a look at the question and then answer your questions. Very important again here is that if your question refers to a certain part of the presentation, that you enter the number on the slide so David knows where or what your question is related to. Okay, let's start. David, are you there? Are you ready?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well, and I can see that the others can also hear you. So let's start with the presentation about conformity assessment and standards development. You have the floor.
Okay, so thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody wherever you happen to be, and welcome to this webinar. My name is David Hanlon. I am the Secretary of the IEC Conformity Assessment Board. This webinar is titled Standards Development. Its objective is to explain why the IEC standards should not have more than a certain amount of conformity assessment in them. Okay, so let's get started. So, the motivation for this webinar was to promote the jointly produced SMB and CAB brochure, which explains what the IEC, that the ISO and IEC directives say about conformity assessment, or CA, in IEC normative documents. Unfortunately, the brochure tends to put people to sleep. So for this reason, we'll try to make it a little more interesting by telling the story of how to put products on the market. The main message is, if standards are to be used worldwide, they have to avoid national modifications. Therefore, standards should not be in conflict with national laws. Putting conformity assessment requirements in standards could conflict with some laws in some countries. I hope you'll find it interesting and informative. But first, a few basic concepts. The first concept is a question. What is CA? Well, CA is conformity assessment, and conformity assessment is simply the act of assessing conformity of, for example, a product, a person, or a service to something. In our case, the something is an IEC standard. Conformity assessment is used to demonstrate that the conformity has been achieved to the standard. In this way, standards and conformity assessment are like two sides of a coin. Neither side has value without the other side. Only together do standards and conformity assessment create value. The next question is, who does CA? In the development of their products, manufacturers and suppliers do testing to ensure that those products are conformant. This is first-party conformity assessment. End users and customers also do testing to check that the products they purchase or receive correspond to the required standards and possible additional specifications. This is second-party conformity assessment. Conformity assessment is also performed by professional testing, inspection, auditing, and certification bodies. These are independent from the manufacturers and end users. They are like a judge in a court case who can give an impartial judgment. This is third-party conformity assessment. The reasons why conformity assessment is performed depends on who is doing it. Manufacturers and suppliers do CA themselves during product development to ensure that their product development goals are met. They then do CA during production to ensure that their claims of conformity are correct. This allows them to confidently make declarations of conformity for marketing claims and to offer warranties and guarantees and so on. End users and customers do CA to check of incoming goods as part of their quality control. They may then release payment for those goods, or conversely, they make claims against the supplier. Third-party CA is performed by professional testing, auditing, inspection, and certification bodies. These professional bodies are usually contracted by the manufacturer, or supplier to test and certify their products. The manufacturer or supplier then uses the certificate for various purposes. Since IEC standards are intended for use by manufacturers, end users, and certification bodies, testing laboratories, and so on, it is important that the standards are written to allow this. As we've seen, these three standards users are defined as first party, second party, and third party. The ISO IEC directives therefore state that the IEC standards shall be written in a way that they are party neutral. Now hopefully we will make this a little more real. For manufacturers, standards are the basis for almost everything. Requirements for safety and performance and so on. Manufacturers then do conformity assessment to confirm conformity. They then can make confident formal declarations of conformity. Such a declaration of conformity often carries legal implications. To reinforce the notion that standards are the basis for formal declaration of conformity, we have the example from ISO IEC 17050-1, Conformity Assessment, Supplier's Declaration of Conformity, Part 1, General Requirements. This is the international standard for Supplier's Declaration of Conformity, or SDOC, and it requires that the standard or the standards be named. Manufacturers and suppliers make declarations of conformity for various reasons. They may be required to do so by law or by regulations in order to be permitted to sell their products. An example of this is the CE marking in Europe. They may be required to do so by the market because their customers expect it, and if they don't, they would not be able to sell their products. They may also make a declaration of conformity because it's in their best interest to do so. It may be part of a marketing plan in which they wish to promote their safety and quality. Another European example is the German product safety law that does not require a declaration of conformity, but most manufacturers and suppliers do it on a voluntary basis. Manufacturers and suppliers sometimes also do more than just make a self-declaration of conformity. In many situations, they will also seek independent third-party verification of conformity. This means they will seek to have their products certified. Of course, certification can be very costly, so they need good reasons to do so, and those reasons will vary depending on the product type and the market conditions. Again, they may be required to do so by regulations or laws to be permitted to sell their products in a specific country. They may be required to do so by the market because their customers expect it. Or they may choose to do so as part of a market entry strategy. For example, if they are an unknown brand within a market, they may compete on price, but will also need to show the market that they have quality. Their way of showing quality will be through a certification. The directives state that IEC standards shall not include CA requirements other than those which are necessary to provide repeatable and reproducible conformity assessment results. This generally means testing procedures. Testing is conformity assessment. So the directives are saying that it's okay to include CA requirements if they are testing procedures. In fact, almost the opposite is true. All standards that have requirements should also have good descriptions of how to determine if those requirements have been met. A good standard should have clearly defined, unambiguous and testable requirements and clearly defined, unambiguous, standardized test methods. The exception to this is, of course, standards that don't have requirements, such as terminology standards. So, to summarize what the manufacturers needs from standards, they clearly need clearly defined, unambiguous and testable requirements. They need clearly defined, unambiguous and standardized test methods and test regimes to ensure consistency and repeatability in their conformity assessment results. Lastly, they need standards to be flexible so that they can seek certification against the standard if necessary and abide with various requirements in various markets. Now we need to look at the other very important users of IEC standards and see their expectations for the standards. National authorities adopt IEC international standards and base their national requirements on them. Then manufacturers and suppliers need to demonstrate compliance to those requirements. But the CA requirements vary widely from country to country. The way of demonstrating compliance to national requirements varies widely depending on the type of product, how and where it will be used, which may then determine whether they are subject to some kind of mandatory conformity assessment, which could involve self-declaration or third-party involvement or even governmental involvement. In the case of third-party certification or governmental involvement, different levels of conformity assessment may apply. For example, for shipment or batch certification, an ISO IEC 17067 Type 1B scheme would be used. For type certification, a Type 1A scheme would be used, while for full product certification, a Type 5 scheme would be used. Traditionally, only electrical safety was considered, including the risk of fire and electrical shock. However, more countries also regulate their other aspects such as EMC or electromagnetic compatibility and HF or high frequency radiation, hazardous substances, energy efficiency and so on. In many countries, a national or regional mark or marking is required. Examples are the European CE marking and G marking in the Arab Gulf region, which rely on supplies declaration. This is typically for low-risk products, while higher-risk products may require certification or an approval mark or label. In this case, sometimes a license or agreement to maintain the validity of a mark or label will be necessary and will come with periodical fees and possible surveillance requirements. Sometimes a test sample of a product must be provided for testing in the target country. What this means is that an existing testing documentation from tests carried outside elsewhere is not acceptable or is not considered as sufficient in the target country. The test sample may be required for full testing, for partial or additional testing, or simply for identification purposes. In any case, the provision of a test sample has several implications. Of course, it raises costs and logistical difficulties. There may be competency issues with the in-house or the in-country laboratory, and in some cases, even the risk of technology theft. But in every case, and perhaps most importantly, it increases the time to market. A longer time to market means lost sales and market share, which can be very significant. Sometimes an in-country handler, being an in-country legal entity, is required. This often means no optional import channels and hence restrictions for marketing the product. On the other hand, it may be useful or even a must in some countries to have somebody locally involved to support and expedite the importation and marketing processes, not least for linguistic and cultural reasons. Sometimes factory visits are required by auditors or inspectors from the target country, and this would be prior to certifying, approving or releasing a product for market access. This may be justifiable in the limited case for high-risk, high-cost products. In any case, this, of course, will cause additional costs and delays. In most cases, costs and time to market are lower in countries that have or allow a wide choice of bodies providing recognized certification and approval services. Lower costs and easier access to markets translates to lower prices and greater choice for consumers and end users. In the European example, the CA requirements are given in the EU directives. Harmonized European standards play an important role due to their presumption of conformity. EU directives and regulations fix the conformity assessment procedures conclusively. When a supplier places the CE marking on its product, there is a presumption that the CE requirements for the module have been met. The veracity of the CE marking concept with its presumption of conformity is backed up with market surveillance, including selection and testing of products already in the market. The CA requirement depends on the category of the product or service. They range from supplier's declaration in modules A and C through type testing or type 1 certification in modules F and G to a full quality assurance system type 5 certification in module H. Modules D and E specify quality management system requirements. If inappropriate CA is specified within a standard, then that standard could not be used within the EU system. The Korean system is somewhat similar to the European system. In Korea, to protect people and their property against electrical shock, fire, and so on from electrical appliances, electrical products are classified into 11 classes with subcategories. In order to sell these products in the Korean market, a KC mark is needed. The conformity assessment requirements to obtain the KC mark vary according to the risk level of the product. In Korea, there are 3 levels of CA. For high-risk items, full certification of conformity is required and includes factory audits and surveillance. This is Type 5 certification. For medium risk items, Type 1 certification is required, while for low risk items, a supplier's declaration of conformity is sufficient. In the case where certification is required, the third-party organizations must be accredited by CATS, the Korean Agency for Technology and Standards, under the MOTI, which is Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy. In North America, there is a greater emphasis on having items certified by an independent testing agency. In fact, the Canadian electrical codes mandate that all products be third-party certified, while the US electrical codes mandate that most all products be third-party certified. In Canada, CSA, the Canadian Standards Association, certifies or approves a broad range of products and uses a very similar identifying mark to identify compliance. The CSA mark used on electrical products also appears on safety shoes, hockey and bicycle helmets, some playground equipment, and even urinals and toilets. While there can be, in some cases, a subtle difference in the mark, the general consumer doesn't understand this. The certification agencies such as CSA and UL, which is Underwriters Laboratories, heavily promote their brand with the message to the consumer, our mark on a product ensures what you're buying is safe. For the most part, consumers accept this message without question, even though they don't usually understand the specific meaning. A further complication in North America is that the certification standards for Canada and the US are often different, which basically requires 2 certificates of compliance. To facilitate this, most North American certification organizations are accredited to approve products for both countries. Each has specific certification marks to indicate compliance to one or both countries. The problem for the consumer is that they all look pretty much the same. The use of certification marks to identify some form of compliance are not unique to North America. Many other countries require such marks of certification. One such example is Australia. Electrical goods sold in Australia must be safe. There are 56 classes of electrical articles classified as declared articles. Declared articles are those that are typically found in residential homes or are articles which are used frequently by consumers. Examples include dishwashers, hair dryers, room heaters and refrigerators. The list of declared articles is regularly reviewed to take into account emerging new technology. In order to sell declared articles in Australia, the articles must be approved and certified as compliant by an accredited, recognized external approval scheme. This means independent third-party certification. The certification process must demonstrate that the electrical article meets all relevant standards. This process includes the testing of these articles in accredited laboratories. Other electrical articles, such as flat-screen televisions and audio equipment, are not declared. However, suppliers must be able to demonstrate compliance with the relevant IEC safety standards. This means first-party approval, also known as Supplier's Declaration, or SDOC. Although I won't provide any more individual country or regional examples, a summary of worldwide trends concerning the needs for product certification and approval can be given as follows. In Europe, the situation is quite stable, although some Eastern European countries are not yet entirely aligned with the EU regime for conformity assessment. In the former Soviet Union region, the roles of the regional Eurasian versus national conformity assessment regimes are as yet not entirely settled. Except for Singapore, regulatory conformity assessment is expected to increase in Southeast Asia. An example of a country where mandatory CA is reducing is Japan, while in the highly regulated markets of China and South Korea, the trend is to increase. In the US and Canada, mandatory product certification will remain, caused largely by the multiple regulation layers at the federal level versus state and province level versus even the city level. Australia and New Zealand have chosen to adopt EU-like CA regimes. In Latin America, in the Middle East and Africa, some countries have well-established regulatory schemes and other countries are likely to follow. In the Middle East, the role of the regional versus national conformity assessment schemes are so far not well settled. Coming back to the directives also state that no IEC standard should make normative references to quality management system standards. The reason for this is again related to the CA requirements in different countries. Some countries require quality management systems in some situations, while others don't. The IEC standards must be written for the widest possible usage. If QMS systems are required, then they should be specified in the national CA requirements. So, to summarize, the fundamental elements of standards that are needed for national application. They need clearly defined, unambiguous and testable requirements. They need standards that they can adopt that will not conflict with their current or future laws. Therefore, they need standards to be flexible so that they can be applied within their own national CA requirements. For the same standard, this may mean that suppliers declaration is sufficient in one country, while in another country, certification is needed. As was indicated at the beginning, the motivation for this webinar was to promote the SMB CAB brochure, which explains what the ISO IEC directives say about conformity assessment, or CA, in IEC normative documents. An important and practical part of the brochure is Clause 3. Clause 3 provides a list of terms whose use in IEC standards should be cautioned. The checklist in Clause 3 of the brochure is a short list of terms. There are also many other terms that will raise red flags with the IEC editors if they are used in IEC standards. An example of such a term is neutral. For example, when used in the expression neutral party or neutral body, and so on. In some circumstances, it is quite all right and appropriate to use some of these terms in IEC standards. However, it is best to avoid using these terms or to seek advice from the IEC technical officer or IEC editors before including them. As I said at the beginning, the main message of this webinar is, if standards are to be used worldwide, they must avoid national modifications. Therefore, standards should not be in conflict with national laws. Putting CA requirements in standards could conflict with some laws in some countries. So that's the end of the presentation part of the of this webinar, and now I'm hoping that that you have possibly given me a few questions, and that I can maybe address those questions. I don't see any questions at this time, so I'm not sure whether there was much interest, in fact, in this webinar. Since I have no other way of feedback from you except through the question section, I'm hoping that I will receive a question. I have a question. It says, can you please tell me IEC standards are developed? I suppose can you please tell me how IEC standards are developed? Well, the IEC standards, the development process are based on the ISO IEC directives, and it is a process that has at least a minimum of 2 commenting stages and 2 voting stages. Some of those stages can go around in circles, can loop back for a while. In general, it takes about 3 years on average for a standard to be developed from a not existing to final international standard publishing. And as I said, that process is written in the ISO IEC directives, which explains the process for developing international standards. There are other types of deliverables that IEC and ISO can create, which are not full international standards, but are lower forms of standardization that are used in various situations. And the development of those entities, which are publicly available specifications and technical reports and technical specifications, they can be developed in a faster time frame with less process and review, commenting and voting by the different national committees. So developing standards, the way that the IEC develops standards can be found in the directives, which can be found on the IEC website. I see another question, which is what drives a country to use IEC standards as opposed to any other organization? Well, IEC, of course, develops standards, international standards for electrotechnical devices. Those standards are developed in an international forum. They are developed by experts that are nominated by the various national committees around the world. Those experts then come into the framework of the development of those standards, and they provide their expertise, and the development of the standard then goes through a process, an international process where the working documents are commented on, they are refined, they are voted on, they are commented on, voted on, and they then become an acceptable international standard, which are then adopted by the national committees, often as a national standard. Sometimes, depending on the situation, the country involved will also add some additional national requirements to the international standard. The reason that the IEC standards are adopted is the same reason the ISO or the ISO standards are adopted, because of the process, because of the legitimacy of the way in which the standards are developed, and that there is this international country-by-country participation in the development. Okay, I have another question. It says, what barriers to trade do they break down? I know we hadn't discussed the 4 systems, so this would take too long to answer. It may be good for the next presentation on conformity assessment. Absolutely, there will certainly be more presentations, webinars on conformity assessment. There is another one coming up in July, and then a last one this year in November. So please look out for those. But just to talk a little bit about the problem of technical barriers to trade, of course, the World Trade Organization's agreement on technical barriers to trade states that the requirements and standards should not be more than to should not be more than that is required to, I forget the exact wording, I'll paraphrase it, should not be greater than is required to determine the criteria, the safety criteria is usually the case, and also in terms of the conformity assessment itself and who carries that, who carries out the conformity assessment. The World Trade Organization also talks about that bodies within the country and qualified bodies outside of the country should also be given equal possibility to do the conformity assessment that is required under the requirements. And when a country states that, or puts a requirement that conformity assessment can only be taken, can only occur within their own country, that can be considered as a technical barrier to trade. And under the World Trade Organization, it would be in conflict with the technical barriers to trade agreement. I'm just trying to look at the questions now, and it says, there's a question, it says, I'm a convener on a terminology MT and found this very useful. Thank you. You mentioned terminology, and I was wondering if you had a specific suggestion on what to avoid in definitions. We are currently going through ours to ensure that there are no inadvertent requirements. Well, the issue with terminology often is that many terms are already defined, and if a technical committee goes off and takes a term that is already defined and then redefines it according to their own needs, this is not necessarily a good thing. In fact, it can be a very bad thing. It may be through ignorance, or it may be because of the syndrome of not invented here or not made here. In any case, it is best to try and find the terms that try and find the source of terms that are already defined, and try and use those definitions as best as possible, with possibly additional notes to apply the term to a specific area or sector. I'm reading again. It says, there's a question, who would we contact during the preparation of a CA standard to avoid non-conformity to IEC directives? Well, if you are an IEC technical committee, you should not be preparing conformity assessment standards. In any case, the ISO IEC directives, which, as I said earlier, define the way in which IEC standards are to be developed state that when a technical committee or when anybody wishes to create a new standard, if that standard concerns conformity assessment, that standard then has to, or the request for that standard has to go to the Standardization Management Board of the IEC, which is of course the board that manages the development of standards in the IEC. And they would then have to look at the intended content of that standard and decide whether it is in fact a conformity assessment standard or if it is not. At some stage, the IEC Conformity Assessment Board, which is the board that manages the conformity assessment activities of the IEC, would also have to review the request for that conformity assessment standard. And the two boards together would then decide whether the technical committee could actually take that request forward or whether there would need to be some other action that is taken and possibly a discussion with the Conformity Assessment Board, the CAB, and possibly with its working groups to determine whether any other form of activity could be put in place if the particular sector represented by the technical committee requires some form of global conformity assessment activities, global certification throughout the world. I'm having a look. Still looking for questions. So there is a question here. Do you plan to do a similar webinar focused on cybersecurity? At this time, for this year, there isn't one planned, but it might be a good idea because the IEC has recently started global, meaning international, worldwide conformity assessment services for cybersecurity. This is our IEC EE conformity assessment system that has started a cybersecurity conformity assessment certification services, which initially are focused towards industry automation, but which can also be used for critical infrastructure of any type. And so it's possibly a very good idea for us to hold a webinar on cybersecurity. So I thank you for that suggestion, and we will look into that. Okay. So I'm still looking at questions. There's a question here. Would you which I think is just in response to what I just said about critical infrastructure. It says, would you classify lighting to be part of critical infrastructure? Lighting, I assume we mean in terms of street lighting, or do we mean electrical supply? Or certainly electrical supply is a critical infrastructure. The issues of the smart grid in the future, of course, will also be will also be a very important issue for cybersecurity, where everybody's smart meter could be an access point to the grid, and where there is no one owner, but multiple owners, in fact hundreds or thousands of part owners of the smart grid. But those are issues for another webinar. So we'll certainly come back to that. Okay, so I think we might leave it at that. So I think we might, as I say, we might leave it at that for now, and I hope that you will tune into the next conformity assessment webinar, which, as I said, is in July, and then there is another one in November. So thank you for your time, and I will let you all get back to your various activities. Thank you and goodbye.